Humans used glass for 700,000 years before anyone made it. If you could stand in Kenya's Rift Valley at a site called Kariandusi, you could pick up the same black stone Homo erectus picked up there. It is obsidian, volcanic glass. Nature was making it long before anything was alive to notice. So the invention was never the material. It was the recipe. Two things in this story are worth waiting for. A pharaoh writing an angry letter about a bad glass gift, and a Roman cup that turns from green to blood red when you light it from inside. All of it starts as heated sand. So does the screen you are holding. Nobody planned any of it. Not a genius, not a workshop, not a lone inventor. So how did humans invent glass? Nature got there first, and it is still doing it. Lightning hits sand at about 30,000 degrees. The sand does not burn, it melts, along the path the bolt takes underground. What cools is a hollow branching tube of glass called a fulgurite. Meteorite impacts do it on a bigger scale, turning stretches of desert floor into sheets of pale yellow glass. One of those sheets ended up carved into a beetle and buried with a teenage king. We will get to him. Volcanoes do it constantly. Lava rich in silica cools too fast for crystals to form, and you get obsidian. Kariandusi is covered in it, and Homo erectus used it because it flakes into an edge sharper than a modern scalpel, so we used glass for hundreds of thousands of years without knowing what it was. We are still not entirely sure. Here is the part everyone gets wrong. You have probably heard that glass is a very slow liquid, and that old cathedral windows are thicker at the bottom because it crept downward. It is a lovely idea. It is also false. Medieval panes were made by spinning molten glass into a flat disc, which comes out thicker at the rim. Glaziers set the heavy edge at the bottom, because that is how anyone hangs a heavy pane. In 1998, the physicist Edgar Zanotto ran the numbers. For medieval glass to flow enough to measure, you would need longer than the age of the universe. So what is it then? Glass is an amorphous solid. A cooling liquid normally locks its atoms into a repeating crystal, but glass cools too fast for that. The atoms freeze while still arranged like a liquid. It is a liquid caught mid-motion. Physicists still argue about how to classify it properly, which brings us to the real problem. Sand does not want to melt. Pure silica turns liquid at 1,713 degrees Celsius. A good kiln in 2500 BC reached about 1,000. That gap is 700 degrees of impossible, so the recipe had to cheat. Add natron, a soda the Egyptians already collected from dried lake beds, and the melting point drops to about 1,000. Now an ordinary kiln is hot enough. But early glass had a second problem. Soda glass dissolves, and a jar left out in the rain slowly turns sticky. The fix is lime, from crushed limestone or shell, which locks the structure in place. Sand, soda, lime. 70%, 15, 10. That recipe is 4,500 years old, and it is still what our windows are made of. So who worked it out? Pliny the Elder had an answer, and people still repeat it. Phoenician merchants land on a beach, light a fire, and prop their pots on blocks of natron. By morning, rivers of glass. It is a great story, and it is impossible. A campfire burns at 600 to 800 degrees, nowhere near enough. The truth is duller and much stranger. Around 2500 BC, workshops in Egypt and Mesopotamia were firing faience, a glazed ceramic and smelting copper. Both leave a crust behind. A glassy skin in the kiln, a glassy slag in the furnace. Someone looked at that crust and did not scrape it away. And it happened twice. Trace element work by Andrew Shortland shows Egyptian and Mesopotamian glass beginning from different local sands, independently. The accident was always going to happen. The only question was, where first? For its first 1,000 years, glass was not cheap. It sat beside gold and lapis lazuli on the list of things kings sent each other. We know because the letters survived. In the Amarna letters, foreign kings write to the pharaoh the way anyone writes to a supplier who sent the wrong color. One complains that his shipment was poor quality. Another just asks for more. And here is the beetle I promised. On Tutankhamun's chest lay a carved scarab, pale yellow and slightly translucent. It is not a gemstone. It is desert glass from the Libyan Sand Sea, formed 29 million years ago when something from space hit the Sahara. The men who carved it had no idea what they were holding. Making a hollow vessel was still brutal work. For 1500 years, every glass bottle was built around a core of clay and dung, wound with hot glass thread by thread. One small perfume flask took hours. Then, around 50 BC, someone on the Levantine coast picked up a hollow iron pipe and blew into a blob of molten glass. The blob inflated like a bubble. A vessel that took hours now took minutes. We do not know their name. That is where glass stops being treasure. A century later, the geographer Strabo notes that in Rome, a drinking cup costs a copper coin. A maker called Ennion signs his molds, which makes him roughly the first brand. Roman builders set panes into walls, and the window openings are still there at Pompeii, and the cup from the opening is real. The Lycurgus Cup sits in the British Museum, murky green in daylight and deep red when lit from inside. The Romans had stirred in gold and silver that broke into particles about 50 nanometers wide. Those particles scatter one color and let the other pass. It is nanotechnology, 1600 years before the word. They did not understand it. They had a recipe that worked. 1,000 years later, the recipe becomes a state secret. In 1291, Venice moves every furnace onto the island of Murano. The stated reason is fire risk. The real reason is containment. Murano glassmakers could carry swords, and their daughters could marry into the nobility. What they could not do was leave. It held for a while. Angelo Barovier perfected cristallo, a glass as clear as rock crystal. Then Colbert, minister to Louis XIV, simply bought the men. French agents smuggled Murano workers to Paris, and the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles is 357 panes of stolen knowledge. But none of that is what glass turned out to be for. Cups, windows, mirrors, beads. For 4,000 years, glass was something we looked at-y. Then people started looking through it. It begins in Italy around 1286 with 2 ground lenses held in a frame. Eyeglasses. Think about what that meant for a scholar. Eyes stopped focusing up close in our 40s, and before lenses that ended reading and fine work. Afterwards, it was an inconvenience. 2 pieces of glass roughly doubled a scholar's working life. The timing mattered. The printing press floods Europe with small print, which raises demand for lenses, which pushes grinders to get better. Better lenses then go somewhere nobody expected. In 1610, Galileo points a tube with 2 lenses at Jupiter and finds 4 moons circling something that is not the Earth. In 1676, Antony van Leeuwenhoek grinds a glass bead the size of a pinhead and finds pond water crowded with living things. Same material, aimed in opposite directions. In under 70 years, 2 shaped pieces of sand showed us a universe far bigger than anyone thought, and far smaller too. Every science after that runs through a lens. The rest is 3 more accidents. In 1903, Edward Benedictus knocks a flask off a shelf. It cracks but doesn't shatter, because dried cellulose film is holding it together inside. That flask is why a windshield crazes instead of turning into shrapnel. In 1952, Alistair Pilkington is watching grease float on dishwater and wonders whether molten glass would float on molten metal. It does, poured onto a bath of liquid tin. It spreads perfectly flat and cools perfectly smooth, with no grinding at all. About 90% of the world's flat glass is made that way now. In 1966, Charles Cow works out that fiber loses light because of impurities, not because glass is cloudy. Purify it, and light carries information for kilometers. He was right, and the Nobel came in 2009. There are now over 500 million kilometers of optical fiber under the ground and the sea. The internet is not in the air, it is in the glass. And a strong thin glass Corning shelved in 1960 sat unsold for 45 years until a phone needed a screen that would not scratch. So, how did humans invent glass? The obvious answer is that somebody clever worked out the recipe. Nobody did. Lightning was making glass before there were people to watch. Homo erectus carried it for 700,000 years and never made any. The first manufactured glass was a crust in a kiln that was busy doing something else. The blowpipe, the safety windshield, the float bath, the optical fiber, every one of them was an accident somebody noticed. So glass was never invented. It was found over and over by people looking at something else. And even that only explains part of it, because most accidents get swept out of the kiln and thrown away. The difference was never clever hands, it was attention. The Egyptians firing faience were making beads and got glass. The Romans blowing bubbles were making cups and got mass production. The Italians grinding lenses were fixing tired eyes and got the moons of Jupiter. Humans used glass for 700,000 years before anyone made it, and we have made it for 4,500 more without ever fully explaining what it is. It is still just heated sand, noticed by someone who did not scrape the strange shiny crust away. You are reading this through it.